Since its release in 2004, much has been written on the popular online video game World of Warcraft. While much of the academic work on WoW takes a sociological or anthropological approach, examining how players interact with the game and each other, in and outside of the game world, or literary approaches that investigate and compare the works of the physical world to WoW, little has been written on how food is portrayed and utilized in WoW. Even less has been written on World of Warcraft, the official cookbook. Food is a part of several systems in World of Warcraft. Food can be crafted by players by combining reagents gathered by slaying enemies or purchasing them from NPC vendors. This food is then consumed by player characters to provide themselves with a range of in-game benefits, primarily ones that improve a player's performance in combat, such as restoring mana or increasing the speed at which they can attack and use abilities. New recipes for better food that provide better bonuses to a player's combat performance can be learned by players who raise their cooking skill, which is accomplished by crafting, note the word crafting, not cooking, increasingly difficult food items. Despite its use in the crafting and combat systems in World of Warcraft, food often doesn't exist in the 3D game world, usually relegated to the player's 2D interface in the form of icons. When a player crafts food, they do so by having the necessary reagents or ingredients in their inventory, selecting the recipe in their cooking interface, and clicking the Create button next to a cooking fire that a player can place in the 3D game world. After clicking Create, the player character does an animation where they appear to be manipulating something between their hands, the reagents are removed from the player's inventory, and the food item is added to the inventory. When food is consumed by the player, it always appears as a drumstick in the 3D game world, and as a metal stein for consuming beverages. However, there are instances of food existing in the 3D game world more prominently, and cases of detailed process-oriented recipes in World of Warcraft. So-called feasts can be consumed by players for combat benefits in the same way other food items can be, but feasts are placed in the 3D game world and can be used by other players, unlike the previously mentioned individual use items. Feasts almost always provide better benefits to players than individual food items, thus incentivizing players to pool and share resources to craft/purchase feasts. Food also sometimes exists as non-interactable items meant to decorate any given area. With the release of patch 10.0.7 on March 21st, 2023, a questline was added for orc characters to complete and earn a new set of wearable armor, in which they'd help restore the lost tradition of the Kosharg, a biannual meeting of the orc clans where they would share news and feast. As part of the Kosharg, some orcs would be allowed to attempt a combat-focused rite of passage, the Am Rigor. However, with the Kosharg's revival, a new rite of passage that's meant to teach not just of the hunt, but what it means to be an orc. A rite for all orcs of age is proposed, the Am Gorah. The player character is chosen to be the first to undergo the new Am Gorah, and is tasked with aiding the spirits of the land, slaying a beast terrorizing young and upcoming orcs, and, most notably for this project, preparing a feast in honor of and for the orcs' ancestors. To prepare this feast, the player enlists the help of Cook Torka, who's in possession of a homemade cookbook that originally belonged to his grandmother Barasha, Spoons and Forks. In it are some of the most detailed cooking recipes one can find in WoW. For instance, the recipe for spicy seared talbuk steak reads, make a dry rub by combining ground peppercorns, flaked sea salt, and dried crushed gorgor roots. Thoroughly coat your talbuk steak on both sides with the dry rub. Let rest for up to 2 hours. Sear your steak on a very hot stone for 3 to 7 minutes per side, depending on the thickness of the cut and desired doneness. Serve with mashed tubers and rock blood gravy. The recipe is far more detailed than the usual just mash these items together approach, though that is how the player ends up making them. To get that true food prep experience, players have to turn to the physical world. Moving into the physical world, World of Warcraft, the official cookbook, offers author Chelsea Monroe Castle's adaptations and interpretations of WoW's recipes. Monroe Castle states that her goal was to keep
things relatively simple, while staying as true as possible to the dishes and recipes within the game.
But what makes a good cookbook? To help establish a baseline of what a good cookbook looks and reads like, I've chosen to look at the top 5 books in the food and diet category on the New York Times bestsellers list and apply Peter Morville's usability criteria to them. Those books are Cooking for Jeffrey, Appetites, Thug Kitchen, Cravings, and the Whole30 Cookbook. Morville's usability criteria focus specifically on web design, but as his suggestions are broadly about how information is presented, it can be neatly applied to cookbooks. In order for a cookbook to have a successful user experience, it needs to be useful, usable, desirable, findable, accessible, and credible. Something is useful when it can, perhaps unsurprisingly, be used for its intended purpose, fulfilling a want or need. When it comes to cookbooks, they're useful when a user can follow its instructions and recreate the recipes, which these New York Times bestsellers all accomplish. Usability has to do with the ease of use. If a cookbook's recipes are too complicated for all but the most accomplished of chefs, most won't find it usable. Critically, if a cookbook is difficult to use, people will give up on it. Desirability has to do with how much someone wants something, and it is often more subjective, differing from person to person. It's often tied up with the brand the cookbook is representing, the visual appeal of the recipes and photographs, and so on. Findability concerns how easy any given item or aspect of a cookbook is to find. Having important information in consistent and easily scanned places from recipe to recipe makes for high findability. Accessibility has a few different angles when it comes to cookbooks. Dietary restrictions and ease of acquiring ingredients. An accessible cookbook would offer alternatives to meat for vegetarian and vegan users. Similarly, an accessible cookbook would use ingredients that the vast majority of users could acquire. Lastly, a cookbook can appear credible in a few ways, such as professional presentation or being written by a notable chef. All of these aspects can be seen in these cookbooks. So, how does the World of Warcraft cookbook measure up? Out of all these criteria, the thing the WoW cookbook does best is convey its desirability to World of Warcraft players. Each recipe is accompanied by a headnote describing the dish as it exists in World of Warcraft. The headnotes are printed in a different font, one that evokes a handwritten on paper with ink sort of feel. For example, on crispy bat wings, the headnote reads,
Based on Abigail Shiel's famous recipe, this Undercity snack is a favorite among the Horde. Every tender bite of this crispy, flavorful dish, whether made with proper bat meat or with chicken as a substitute, will satisfy any adventurer's cravings.
This headnote gives the context the dish was created in, where it's from, and the people that typically enjoy it, while also promising that any adventurer will enjoy it. Another headnote for Forest Strider drumsticks reads,
These drumsticks, they're huge! There's nothing quite like Forest Strider drumsticks to power you through a full round of games and exotic delights offered at the Darkmoon Fair.
Here too, the headnote is trying to sell the fantasy that the reader is a denizen of Azeroth. The casual way the size of the fictional Forest Striders, very large birds, sort of like ostriches, drumsticks are referred to help the reader's immersion. It also references the in-game Darkmoon Fair, a once-a-month, one-week fair that players can attend to play games and earn rewards. By invoking it this way, the headnote is implying that by cooking these drumsticks, you're bringing food into your home that you'd normally only be able to get at this fair, not unlike fairs in the physical world. The photographs also add to the desirability, depicting a whole range of delicious entrees, desserts, drinks, and more. The photography also helps add to the cookbook's credibility per the professional presentation. Also adding to its credibility is author Chelsea Monroe Castle, a self-described artist and fan of fantasy. What started out as a food blog about Game of Thrones became an official cookbook for the franchise, and she has since gone on to write official cookbooks for a slew of sci-fi and fantasy franchises, including Star Wars, Firefly, The Elder Scrolls, and Activision Blizzard's own Overwatch. Lindsay Bloom, writing on food writing, finds that the credibility of an author is important, stating that readers must trust the integrity, authority, and therefore the judgment and tastes of the authorial persona. Their recipes must be repeatedly kitchen-tested. To fail would be to fail the reader. With Monroe Castle's body of work, readers can trust in her tastes. The instructions for each recipe prove to be largely usable. Sentences are written in a consistent action-first style that aids in understanding. I would have preferred if some of the steps were split up into smaller steps, as many of the recipes have only 2 to 3 blocks of text, and these blocks are pretty dense. One thing the cookbook fails to do is list out the necessary cookware and tools one will need for any given recipe, making things a bit less findable. For example, in Fell Eggs and Ham, and indeed in all of the recipes, this information is buried within the sometimes dense instructions. This recipe requires you to have a medium saucepan, a medium bowl, a sharp knife, the bowl of a food processor, and a paper towel-covered plate, but a user is required to parse the entire recipe for this important information. While the cookbook is certainly still usable, this does bring it down a tad. It wasn't until after recording and writing that section that I realized that, in fact, no cookbooks seem to do this. It is not common for cookbooks to list out the tools and cookware that you'll need to create a recipe. Why not? It seems like such an obvious thing to do. Maybe I'm just showing how inexperienced I am with cooking. Each recipe has a cordoned off section in the shape of a bookmark in the top right corner with some quick, useful information in it. These sections are color-coded to 3 different levels of skill level needed to prepare each recipe: Apprentice, Expert, and Master, colored bronze, silver, and gold, respectively. Most also have the icon from the game of the item that the recipe is based on. Next, information on how much time one can expect to spend preparing and cooking or baking will take. Users will also find how much you can expect to make of any given recipe, be it in servings or ounces. Lastly, a pairing recommendation and a page number to direct users to the recommended dish. These sections add to the cookbook's desirability, as these sections mirror the skill requirements for cooking items in-game. On a similar note, there's a page near the front titled Achievements, presenting a task to users to level up their skills by cooking 5 recipes from each of the categories: the way of the loaf, the way of the entree, etc. At which point, they'll become a master cook. Achievements exist in World of Warcraft, requiring players to complete a task or tasks, and sometimes giving players rewards, such as a title that a player can append to their name. In this way, users can get a similar sense of accomplishment by using the cookbook. Monroe Castle strives to make the recipes in the cookbook accessible to people with dietary restrictions. In her own words,
"In the back of this book is a helpful list of all the recipes covered, organized into sections for vegetarian, vegan, and gluten-free cooking. In addition, a number of recipes are marked to indicate that, with a few small changes, they can be made to fit one of those categories."
She admits, however, that as people's own tastes and restrictions are varied and many, guidelines rather than specific suggestions are better suited for these recipes. For vegetarians, she recommends replacing a chicken broth for a vegetable or mushroom-based broth. For gluten-free diets, bread and flour replacements. These guidelines allow users with these restrictions to use the cookbook as seamlessly as possible. As many of the ingredients found in World of Warcraft are fictitious, concessions have to be made when adapting in-game recipes to a physical world cookbook. For example, fell eggs and ham normally requires one to use fell eggs and fell ham, ingredients tinged by demon magic, which gives them a greenish appearance. As demon magic is often hard to come by, a concession is made by adding in avocado and wasabi to give the dish the green appearance it needs. Other recipes make smaller concessions, such as stuffed mushrooms. In-game, the recipe requires a player to have some mushrooms, which are fictional, but very mushroom-like. Due to their similarities, adapting this recipe to the physical world only requires a small change from mushroom to button mushroom. However, in some instances, even when ingredients for a dish exist, changes are made to adapt to a Western audience's tastes and sensibilities. For example, crispy bat wings call for bat wings, but the headnote notes that chicken wings can be used as a substitute. Despite this, the ingredients list doesn't note bat wings at all, instead opting for chicken wings to be the primary ingredient. While bats in the physical world don't match the often gargantuan size of bats in WoW, and by extension don't have as much meat on them, they do exist and are edible. Why then does Monroe Castle make this adaptation? This cookbook's intended audience is English-speaking WoW players with a penchant for home cooking. Bat meat is not a common ingredient in English-speaking cuisines, broadly. Therefore, despite the physical existence of bats, chicken is a much more palatable meat to the intended reader. Despite a few stumbles, the cookbook succeeds at presenting recipes with simple and easy-to-follow instructions for home chefs of various skill levels and of various dietary restrictions. It successfully conveys the feeling of being a cook in the world of Azeroth, delivering that fantasy feel through its flavor text. That's all I got. Bye!
You're a star!